Step out of the vehicle now.
Officer, I provided my license. What is the reason for this stop?
I said step out. Don't argue with me.
I'm not resisting. I'm asking a lawful question.
Ma'am, step back and put your hands where I can see them.
I do not consent to any search.
Hands on the hood. Do it.
It was 2:17 on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, but the flashing blue police lights in her rearview mirror signaled that everything was about to change. Judge Barbara Taylor had just finished lunch with her colleagues and was driving back to the courthouse. It was then that Officer Marcus Wright made a career-ending decision to pull her over. What happened next would not only expose a rogue cop and destroy a career built on the abuse of power, but it would also trigger one of the largest civil rights settlements in the state's history. Before we delve into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, because the way this case unfolds will absolutely stun you. Judge Barbara Taylor had served on the federal bench for 15 years. She was highly respected, accomplished, and known for her fair, yet firm judicial style. At 52, she had presided over thousands of cases, ranging from complex corporate fraud to heinous violent crimes. She drove a modest sedan, lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and hadn't received so much as a speeding ticket in her entire adult life. That Tuesday afternoon, beneath her judicial robe, which she had removed during her lunch break, was her usual professional attire. Her driving was impeccable, with nothing erratic or suspicious about it. She was traveling 5 miles below the speed limit, using her turn signals, and obeying every traffic law to the letter. But to Officer Wright, none of that mattered. Wright had been on the force for 8 years. On paper, he appeared to be a competent officer, with commendations and positive performance reviews to his name. But what his superiors didn't know, or perhaps chose to ignore, was a disturbing pattern lurking within Wright. He seemed to take a particular pleasure in the humiliation of those with higher social standing than himself. When Wright saw Judge Taylor driving her sedan through downtown, some dark, predatory instinct was triggered within him. Perhaps it was her confident composure, her professional appearance, or simply the fact that she was a seemingly successful black woman. Whatever the reason, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At first, the traffic stop seemed routine. Wright approached the driver's side window, his hand resting habitually on his weapon, a gesture that immediately struck Judge Taylor as needlessly aggressive, setting off an alarm. Having handled enough criminal cases, she could keenly discern when an officer was looking for trouble, not just doing their job. Wright demanded her license and registration, but offered no reason for the stop. Judge Taylor calmly handed over the documents while asking what statute she had violated. Ignoring her question, Wright walked back to his patrol car, leaving her to wait. She waited for nearly 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, Wright furiously ran her information through every database at his disposal. He was searching for anything, any pretext to escalate the situation. An outstanding warrant, an unpaid ticket, a suspended license, any blemish that would give him leverage over this woman he perceived as arrogant. But Judge Taylor's record was as clean as a blank slate. No warrants, no fines, no violations. Nothing. Her license, registration, and insurance were all impeccable. Wright felt a surge of frustration, but he wasn't about to give up. When he returned to her car, his demeanor had shifted. It was more aggressive, more confrontational. He ordered her out of the vehicle. Judge Taylor asked why, stating that she had provided all requested documents and had broken no traffic laws. Wright raised his voice, repeating his command. Judge Taylor complied, but she also did something with incredible foresight, an act that would later prove to be the key to turning the tables. She discreetly activated the recording function on her phone, which lay quietly in the car's cup holder. Everything that happened next was faithfully captured in crystal clear audio. Wright ordered her to place her hands on the hood of the car. Again, Judge Taylor asked what violation had prompted the stop. Wright crudely told her to shut up and do as she was told. His language became increasingly aggressive, far exceeding the bounds of a professional traffic stop. Then, Wright made his first fatal mistake. Without consent or any probable cause, he began searching her handbag. Judge Taylor stated clearly that she did not consent to a search and demanded to see a warrant. Wright scoffed, saying he didn't need her permission or a warrant. As he rummaged through her belongings, Wright found her judicial ID. For most officers, this would have been the moment of instant realization and profuse apologies. But Wright was not most officers. Instead, he accused her of possessing a fake ID and impersonating a federal judge. Judge Taylor calmly explained that she was, in fact, a sitting federal judge, and suggested he contact the courthouse to verify. Wright's response laid bare the prejudice and arrogance at his core. He said he didn't care if she was the President of the United States. Today, she was going to learn some respect. Quick question: have you ever personally witnessed police misconduct? If so, type yes in the comments. Wright handcuffed Judge Taylor and shoved her into the back of his patrol car. Even as her constitutional rights were being trampled in broad daylight, she remained calm and professional. Her request to speak with his supervisor was met with a command to shut up. What Wright didn't realize was that Judge Taylor possessed a photographic memory for legal procedures and constitutional law. Every illegal step he took, every violation of her rights, every improper comment was being precisely cataloged in her mind like a legal brief, building the framework for the lawsuit she was already planning. The arrest was based entirely on lies. Wright claimed she was driving erratically, but his dashcam footage mercilessly debunked that lie. He claimed she was aggressive and uncooperative, but the audio recording proved she had been polite and compliant throughout. He claimed she resisted arrest, but a bystander who saw the entire incident would later testify that she never resisted in any way. Wright transported Judge Taylor to the county jail, where an even more humiliating farce unfolded. He told the booking officers that she was a career criminal impersonating a federal judge. He suggested that, in addition to his fabricated traffic violations, she be charged with identity theft and fraud. The experienced booking officers immediately sensed something was wrong. They had processed enough real criminals to know that Judge Taylor did not fit the profile. Her demeanor, her elocution, her familiarity with legal procedure, everything about her screamed that she was exactly who she claimed to be. While Wright was filling out paperwork, one of the booking officers quietly contacted the federal courthouse. Within 30 minutes, the court confirmed Judge Barbara Taylor was indeed a sitting federal judge, and she was supposed to be presiding over a sentencing hearing that very afternoon. The jail's supervisor, a 25-year veteran, instantly grasped the gravity of the situation. A police officer had unlawfully arrested a federal judge on fabricated charges. This was far more than misconduct. For everyone involved, this was career suicide. The supervisor tried to handle it quietly, approaching Wright and suggesting they release Judge Taylor immediately and let the whole thing go. However, Wright, whether out of extreme stupidity or extreme arrogance, flatly refused. He insisted she was a fraud and demanded she be processed in full. It was at that moment the supervisor made a call that would end Wright's career. He contacted the chief of police, the district attorney, and the local FBI field office. Within an hour, the jail was swarming with investigators, internal affairs officers, and federal agents. Judge Taylor was immediately released, with profuse apologies from everyone except Wright, who remained defiant. She was offered medical and counseling services and any other assistance she might need. She politely declined, asking only for copies of all reports and recordings related to her arrest. What happened next would make Wright wish he had never chosen to wear the uniform. The FBI launched a civil rights investigation into Wright. Within hours, the police department initiated an internal affairs investigation. The district attorney's office began reviewing every single case Wright had ever been involved in, and Judge Taylor hired the best civil rights attorney in the state. The evidence against Wright was mountainous and overwhelming. The dashcam video proved Judge Taylor's innocence. The audio recording captured his every illegal act and improper comment. Multiple witnesses corroborated that Judge Taylor had been cooperative the entire time. As the investigation deepened, a more devastating truth emerged. Wright had a systemic bias against successful black professionals. Over the past 3 years, he had made dozens of questionable arrests. The targets, almost without exception, were black doctors, lawyers, business owners, and other professionals. The department's own data showed that, despite working the same beats and shifts as his colleagues, Wright arrested black drivers at 5 times the rate of white drivers. His arrest reports were often riddled with inaccuracies or were outright fabrications. Complaints against him were either ignored or dismissed without a proper investigation. Internal Affairs discovered that Wright had bragged to fellow officers about putting arrogant people in their place. He made racist remarks in the locker room and even kept a personal scorecard of how many suits he had humiliated. The deeper investigators dug, the worse it got for Wright and the entire department. They found evidence of supervisors covering up complaints and of discriminatory policies, evidence pointing to a culture that didn't just tolerate racism, but tacitly encouraged it. Judge Taylor's case became the epicenter of a federal civil rights investigation that ultimately resulted in a consent decree, placing the entire police department under federal oversight for the next 2 years. But for Wright, the nightmare was just beginning. The arrest of a federal judge ignited a national media firestorm, and his face was plastered across every news outlet. Civil rights lawyers from across the country began calling Judge Taylor, offering their services pro bono. She chose Angelique Martinez, a legendary litigator who had won over $200 million in settlements from police departments nationwide. Martinez was famous for her sharp, relentless cross-examinations and her unparalleled ability to expose systemic corruption within law enforcement. The lawsuit, filed 3 months later, was a masterpiece of legal strategy. It targeted not only Wright's individual misconduct, but also held the entire department accountable for creating and sustaining a culture of racial discrimination. The lawsuit named Wright, his supervisor, the chief of police, and the city as defendants. The complaint painted a chilling picture. Wright's actions were not random, but part of a systematic campaign of harassment, targeting black elites with surgical precision. Martinez interviewed 43 victims who had been illegally stopped, searched, or arrested by Wright over the past 5 years. Their stories were shockingly similar. Successful black men and women, driving through the downtown area, were pulled over for fabricated violations, subjected to humiliating searches, and often arrested on bogus charges that were later dropped. Dr. Michael Stevens, a renowned surgeon, described how Wright pulled him over on his way to an emergency surgery, forcing him to stand in the rain for over an hour while he searched his BMW, causing him to miss the operation and nearly endanger a patient's life. Sarah Johnson, an attorney, recounted how Wright arrested her in front of her children simply because she questioned why he needed to search her vehicle during a routine traffic stop. She spent 6 hours in jail before the charges were mysteriously dropped. David Chun, a business owner, told of how Wright handcuffed him outside his own restaurant, claiming he looked suspicious walking around the building. Mr. Chun was simply doing his nightly property check, something he had done every night for 15 years. The pattern was undeniable, and Martinez used it as a weapon to build an ironclad case not just against Wright, but against the entire corrupt system that had enabled and protected him for years. Wright's legal defense was doomed from the start. His lawyer tried to argue that he was simply following proper procedure and that Judge Taylor was uncooperative. That narrative crumbled in minutes when Martinez played the full audio recording in court. The jury clearly heard Wright say he didn't care if she was the president. They heard him search her private belongings without consent. They heard him make improper comments about teaching her a lesson. They heard him fabricate charges and lie to the jail staff. Wright's lawyer then pivoted, arguing the arrest was a good faith mistake, that Wright genuinely believed Judge Taylor was an imposter. That argument also collapsed when Martinez presented evidence that Wright had access to multiple databases that could have instantly verified her identity. But Martinez wasn't content with just proving Wright's guilt. She wanted to expose the entire rotten system that allowed him to operate with impunity for so long. During discovery, she uncovered internal emails showing that supervisors knew about the complaints against Wright but chose to ignore them. One particularly damning email from Wright's sergeant read, "Wright knows how to handle the troublemakers in our district. Sometimes you have to let these people know who's boss." Another email, from a lieutenant, discussed reassigning Wright to a more active area, a thinly veiled code for a predominantly black neighborhood. The department's own training records showed that Wright had been cited multiple times for excessive force and improper arrest procedures, but never faced meaningful discipline. His personnel file contained 19 citizen complaints, all of which were dismissed without a proper investigation. Martinez also discovered that the department had an unofficial quota system that rewarded officers for making arrests in certain neighborhoods. Wright consistently led the department in arrests, earning him praise from supervisors who cared more about statistics than constitutional rights. The trial lasted 6 weeks and became a media spectacle. Every day, the courtroom was packed with journalists, civil rights activists, and community members eager to see justice served. Judge Taylor testified for 2 days, describing with the same calm composure she used on the bench how Wright violated her rights and humiliated her in public. Her testimony was devastating. She methodically dissected how each of Wright's actions violated the 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. She detailed the emotional trauma of being handcuffed and jailed like a common criminal despite having committed no crime. But perhaps most powerfully, she spoke to the broader impact of Wright's actions. She explained how such behavior erodes public trust in law enforcement, making it harder for other, decent officers to do their jobs. She spoke of the chilling message his actions sent to the Black community, that no amount of success or education could protect them from police harassment. When Wright took the stand in his own defense, it was an unmitigated disaster. Under Martinez's cross-examination, he contradicted himself repeatedly. He couldn't explain his initial reason for pulling Judge Taylor over. He couldn't justify searching her belongings without consent. He couldn't provide a shred of evidence to support any of the charges he had leveled against her. When Martinez questioned him about his pattern of targeting Black professionals, Wright became defensive and angry. He denied being a racist, while simultaneously making comments that revealed his true feelings about successful Black people. But the final nail in Wright's coffin came when Martinez played a segment of his own body cam footage from a previous arrest. In the recording, Wright could be heard saying, "These guys think their fancy degrees make them better than us. I'm going to show them who really has the power." As the recording played, the color drained from Wright's face. His lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury had heard, in Wright's own words, the naked motivation behind his targeting of successful Black citizens. Expert witnesses testified on racial profiling and the psychological trauma of police misconduct. Dr. Angela Foster, a leading researcher on police bias, explained how Wright's actions fit the classic pattern of officers who use their badge to enforce a racial hierarchy. Another expert, a former police chief for the city, testified on proper traffic stop procedures and explained how every one of Wright's actions violated basic police training and constitutional principles. He called Wright's conduct one of the most egregious examples of police misconduct he had seen in his 30-year career. The city's legal team desperately tried to limit their liability. They argued that Wright was a rogue officer, acting outside the scope of his training, and that the city shouldn't be held responsible for his personal actions. This defense backfired spectacularly when Martinez presented evidence that the city was well aware of Wright's pattern of misconduct but had failed to take corrective action. Internal affairs records showed the department had received dozens of complaints about Wright, but systematically buried them without proper investigation. Supervisors had received reports of his improper comments but took no disciplinary action. The city's own policies required officers to report misconduct by their peers, but multiple officers testified they were discouraged from filing reports against Wright, fearing retaliation from supervisors who protected him for his high arrest numbers. Martinez also proved that the city had paid out settlements in several prior cases involving Wright, but had never investigated for a systemic problem. The city, in effect, had been paying to cover up Wright's crimes while allowing him to continue harming its citizens. In her closing argument, Martinez delivered a powerful speech that brought several jurors to tears. She spoke of how Wright had weaponized his badge to terrorize law-abiding citizens simply because of their race. She explained how his actions represented everything wrong with American policing and why a massive damages award was necessary to deter similar misconduct in the future. Wright's lawyer offered a lackluster defense, pleading for understanding of the dangers police face. But after weeks of evidence showcasing Wright's systemic abuse of power, the plea fell on deaf ears. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning their verdict. They found Wright liable for violating Judge Taylor's constitutional rights under color of law. They found his supervisor liable for failing to properly train and supervise him. They found the chief of police liable for maintaining policies that condoned racial profiling. And they found the city liable for creating and perpetuating a culture of discrimination. Then came the damages award, which sent a shockwave through the courtroom. They awarded Judge Taylor $6 million. A total of $6 million. $2 million in compensatory damages for her pain, suffering, and emotional distress, and $4 million in punitive damages, designed to punish the defendants and deter future misconduct. A cheer erupted from the community members packed into the gallery. Judge Taylor remained stoic, as a judge would. But those who knew her could see the vindication in her eyes. Justice had been served. But for Wright and the police department, the reckoning had just begun. The $6 million verdict sent tremors through law enforcement agencies across the state. Police chiefs began urgently reviewing their own department's practices, terrified they might be harboring their own Marcus Wrights. Training programs were hastily implemented, and complaint procedures were overhauled. For Wright personally, however, the financial judgment was merely the prelude to his downfall. The FBI's criminal investigation was still underway. Federal prosecutors were considering charging him with violating Judge Taylor's civil rights under color of law. If convicted, Wright faced up to 10 years in federal prison. The criminal indictment came down 6 weeks after the civil verdict. Federal prosecutors had spent months building an airtight case. The indictment was devastating: deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, filing a false police report, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Each count carried significant prison time. Wright's world imploded overnight. His police pension was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal case. His wife filed for divorce, taking their 2 children and moving across the country to live with her parents. Without his police salary, he couldn't make his mortgage payments, and his house went into foreclosure. The media spotlight was relentless. His mugshot appeared in every national news outlet. His name became synonymous with police corruption and racial bias. On the day of his arraignment, protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding the maximum sentence for all involved. And it wasn't just Wright facing the consequences. His supervisor, Sergeant David Walsh, was also indicted for conspiracy and willful disregard of civil rights violations. Prosecutors argued that Walsh not only willfully ignored the complaints against Wright, but had effectively encouraged his discriminatory behavior through reassignments and positive reviews. Police Chief Robert Martinez also faced federal civil rights charges. The investigation revealed that he had received detailed reports on Wright's pattern of misconduct, but chose to cover them up to protect the department's image. Emails showed Martinez was more concerned with negative publicity than with constitutional violations. The trial of the 3 men became a national spectacle. Legal experts called it one of the most significant police misconduct cases in decades. Civil rights organizations sent representatives to observe every day of the proceedings. The court required extra security to manage the crowds of protesters and media personnel. Wright's federal trial revealed even more disturbing details about his conduct. Prosecutors presented evidence that he had planted drugs on at least 3 black suspects to justify arrests. Bodycam footage showed him dropping small baggies of marijuana during a search, only to discover them moments later. Dr. Jennifer Hassan, a prominent psychiatrist, testified how Wright had destroyed her reputation in the medical community by arresting her on a fabricated drug possession charge. It cost her $50,000 in legal fees to clear her name, but the arrest had already lost her hospital privileges and several lucrative consulting contracts. The prosecution also revealed that Wright had been selling information about upcoming arrests to criminal organizations. He would tip off drug dealers about planned raids in exchange for cash payments. The corruption went far beyond racial bias and into outright criminality. Wright's lawyer tried to portray him as a dedicated officer who made a mistake under pressure. That defense fell apart when prosecutors played recordings of Wright bragging to other officers about his arrests. In one recording, Wright described how much he enjoyed watching arrogant professionals squirm as he put them in handcuffs. The jury also heard from a former police informant who described how Wright coerced him into giving false testimony against black suspects. The informant, granted immunity for his testimony, detailed a systematic scheme to fabricate evidence and manufacture probable cause. Expert witnesses explained how Wright's actions violated every fundamental principle of constitutional policing. Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a professor of criminology, testified that Wright's conduct represented the worst aspects of police culture and showed how unchecked power can corrupt those sworn to protect and serve. The defense called character witnesses who described Wright as a family man and community volunteer. But after weeks of evidence showcasing his systemic abuse of power, their testimony rang hollow. Several character witnesses actually hurt Wright's case by admitting under cross-examination that they had never witnessed his police work firsthand. Sergeant Walsh's trial revealed how a failure of supervision had enabled Wright's reign of terror. Internal affairs investigators testified that Walsh received detailed complaints about Wright's conduct but dismissed them without proper investigation. Walsh had even coached Wright on how to write his reports to justify questionable arrests. The prosecution presented evidence that Walsh actively participated in the conspiracy to violate citizens' civil rights. He reassigned Wright to predominantly black neighborhoods specifically to increase arrest numbers. He praised Wright's aggressive tactics in performance reviews while ignoring glaring signs of misconduct. Walsh's lawyer argued he was just following orders from superior officers who demanded higher arrest stats. But prosecutors showed that Walsh had gone far beyond mere compliance and had actively facilitated Wright's discriminatory practices. Police Chief Martinez faced the most severe charges due to his position of authority. The prosecution argued that he had created and maintained a culture that not only tolerated racial bias, but actively rewarded it. Martinez promoted officers based on arrest numbers, with no regard for constitutional compliance or citizen complaints. Evidence against Martinez included his own emails discussing the need to keep certain neighborhoods in line through aggressive policing. He repeatedly ignored recommendations from internal affairs investigators to discipline Wright and other problem officers. Martinez's trial exposed systemic corruption throughout the entire police department. Investigators found that, under his leadership, racial bias training had been removed from the academy curriculum. The complaint investigation process had been deliberately weakened to shield officers from accountability. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for all 3 defendants. Wright was convicted on 8 felony counts related to civil rights violations, false imprisonment, and corruption. Walsh was convicted of conspiracy and willful disregard. Martinez was convicted of the most serious charges related to maintaining a criminal conspiracy within the police department. Sentencing day arrived on a cold December morning, exactly 18 months after Wright first spotted Judge Taylor driving through downtown. The courtroom was at capacity, with an overflow room set up with a video feed. Wright was sentenced first. Having reviewed thousands of pages of evidence and victim impact statements, Federal Judge Robert Chun delivered a scathing assessment of Wright's crimes. He called Wright's actions a cancer on the institution of law enforcement and noted that his conduct had undermined public trust in police across the nation. Wright was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He was ordered to pay restitution to all identified victims of his misconduct. His police certification was permanently revoked, and he was barred from ever working in law enforcement again. The moment the sentence was announced, Wright's legs gave out, and he collapsed into his chair. His lawyer had to physically support him as the judge continued to read the terms of his punishment. Assuming he serves his full term, Wright will be 62 years old when he is released. Sergeant Walsh was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for his role in enabling Wright's crimes. The judge noted that supervisors have a special responsibility to prevent misconduct, and Walsh had failed spectacularly. His pension was forfeited, and he was ordered to pay significant restitution to the victims. Police Chief Martinez received the harshest sentence, 12 years in federal prison. Judge Chun explained that with leadership comes the highest level of responsibility and accountability. Martinez's failure to address known problems had enabled years of civil rights abuses affecting hundreds of citizens. The sentences sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community nationwide. Police chiefs began immediately reforming their complaint investigation procedures and bias training programs. The fear of federal prosecution for civil rights violations became a powerful motivator for departments to take misconduct seriously. But the fallout extended far beyond the 3 defendants. The entire police department was placed under federal oversight through a consent decree that would last for at least 10 years. Every policy, training program, and disciplinary procedure would be subject to federal approval and monitoring. The city was forced to pay an additional $42 million in settlements to other victims of Wright's misconduct who came forward after the lawsuit. These victims included doctors, lawyers, teachers, business owners, and other professionals targeted solely because of their race and success. Judge Taylor used the media attention to advocate for broader police reform. She testified before the U.S. Congress, arguing for the necessity of federal legislation to address systemic bias in law enforcement. Her powerful testimony, delivered with the same calm authority she used during her own trial, helped build momentum for significant policy changes. The police academy was completely restructured under federal oversight. New recruits were required to complete extensive bias training and community engagement programs. Veteran officers had to undergo retraining or face dismissal. The culture of the department slowly began to shift as problem officers were purged and replaced by community-oriented professionals. Wright's former colleagues distanced themselves from him as quickly as possible. Officers who once laughed at his off-color jokes now claimed they had always been uncomfortable with his behavior. The blue wall of silence that had protected him for years crumbled as officers faced federal scrutiny of their own conduct. The case became a landmark precedent for civil rights lawsuits against police departments. Law schools began teaching Taylor versus Wright as a case study in how individual misconduct can expose systemic problems and lead to massive municipal liability. Wright's family paid a heavy price for his crimes. His children faced harassment at school, and had to change their names to escape the stigma. His ex-wife struggled to find work due to her association with his case. The ripple effects of his actions devastated more than one family. From his federal prison cell, Wright watched as his former department underwent a radical transformation. New leadership, new policies, new training, and new accountability measures were all put in place. The culture in which he had once thrived was systematically dismantled and replaced with the principles of true community policing. The FBI's investigation expanded to other police departments after discovering that Wright's misconduct was part of a broader pattern of civil rights violations across multiple jurisdictions. Federal prosecutors opened investigations in 6 other cities, leading to more indictments and consent decrees. Judge Taylor returned to her federal bench with enhanced credibility and moral authority. Her personal experience as a victim of police misconduct gave her a unique and profound insight into the intersection of law enforcement and civil rights. She went on to write landmark legal opinions that strengthened protections for citizens against police abuse. The case also led to legislative changes at the state level. Lawmakers passed bills requiring independent investigations of police misconduct complaints and creating civilian oversight boards with real power to discipline officers. Police unions fought the changes but lacked public support in the wake of the Wright scandal. The community's trust in law enforcement, so badly damaged by Wright's actions, began to slowly rebuild under new leadership. Town hall meetings, community policing initiatives, and transparency measures helped bridge the divide between the police and the citizens they were meant to serve. But for Wright, sitting in his prison cell, wearing federal inmate blues instead of police blues, there was no redemption story. For the fleeting satisfaction of humiliating a successful black citizen, he had thrown away his career, his freedom, his family, and his reputation. The power he had once wielded so callously was gone forever, replaced by the powerlessness of incarceration. His appeals were denied at every level. Federal judges found his claims of prosecutorial overreach or excessive sentencing to be without merit. The evidence of his guilt was simply too overwhelming, the pattern of misconduct too clear, and the harm to his victims too severe to justify any leniency. The story of Wright's downfall became a cautionary tale, required reading in police academies across the country as a vivid example of how a law enforcement career can be swiftly consumed by racism and corruption. New recruits learned about constitutional policing not just as legal theory, but as a practical necessity to avoid federal prosecution. Years later, while Wright remained in federal prison, Judge Taylor continued to serve with distinction on the federal bench. She had transformed her traumatic experience into a force for positive change that would protect countless future victims from enduring what she had on that Tuesday afternoon. The intersection where Wright first spotted Judge Taylor became a symbol of how a single, decisive moment can forever alter the course of countless lives. His choice to target her because of her race and apparent success seemed to him like just another routine act of harassment. Instead, it became the beginning of the end for everything he thought he had built. Wright's choice to pull over Judge Taylor on that Tuesday afternoon cost him everything. His 15-year prison sentence, his broken family, his lost pension, and his permanent disgrace all stemmed from that one moment when he decided a successful black woman needed to be taught a lesson. For years, he had brandished his badge like a weapon, terrorizing innocent citizens while his department looked the other way. Judge Taylor's 6 million victory sent a clear message. Officers who abuse their power will be held accountable. Her courage to fight back exposed an entire corrupt system and changed the way police misconduct is investigated and prosecuted. Wright learned the hard way that in an age of smartphones and federal oversight, racism has consequences, and some people simply can't afford the price. The blue lights that flashed in Judge Taylor's rearview mirror that day didn't just signal a traffic stop. They signaled the beginning of the end for a corrupt cop who thought he was untouchable. Justice was served, but the work of rebuilding trust between communities and law enforcement continues every single day. This case was intense, but the one on the right is even crazier.